to 10 years, we have revised and updated our comprehensive facilities master plan. So the last time this was done was in 2007. We are experiencing a lot of growth in the southeast side of the district and the northeast side of the district, particularly those two areas. And so in July of 2014, we got a group of experts together to begin the process of preparing an update. So that group consists of staff members from PSD, including our planner, experts from the city of Fort Collins and Larimer County, and private construction and architecture firms, as well as a demographer that we hired who specializes in predicting the future number of students that we should expect and in which areas and in which school boundaries. So we hired Strategic Resources West, who has worked with the district in the past and is familiar with our district. At this time, the draft plan that you have in front of you is just that. It is a draft. It is our best thinking at this time based on a lot of hours spent with a lot of experts in the room. So we do believe it is a reasonable plan, but we have planned for almost a year of community engagement, including nights like tonight. So the actual final plan will not go to the board for approval until March of 2016. So next March, the board will have to approve what is the final plan. So we have lots of opportunities for the community to react to this plan and tell us what you think. So we have two basic needs going on right now. We have observable growth, as I mentioned, and particularly in two edges of the district, and we have aging buildings in the rest of the district. If you look at Larimer County population projections, you can see the drastic growth that is projected to happen in the next couple decades. Now, PSD does not serve all of Larimer County, but the growth in Larimer County we're experiencing here within our district boundaries as well. If you look at our own current enrollment projections for the next 5 years, these are the numbers that came in from the demographer last fall. I will tell you that, so the projection was by 2019 that we would have 30,500 students approximately, and that this year we were supposed to have 28,500, and you can see that we've already exceeded that projection by 500 students by October. So we are growing quickly, and as you feel it very personally here at ZAC, we can feel the crowding in a lot of our buildings. So as we look for solving these two problems, ongoing facilities needs of our older buildings and a need to establish new buildings for growth, it's important for you to understand that we are not talking at this time about any school closures. So at this point in time, this plan does not include any school closures. So the principals of all of the schools have been leading conversations with their staffs and their school accountability committees to talk about if they're in an older building, what are their wishes and desires for their buildings? What does each community wish they could have the next time we have some money to spend on improvements of buildings? At the same time, our facilities department has a facilities audit of each building that from strictly the facilities point of view tells what are the greatest needs for ongoing maintenance and improvement in each building. So we will crosswalk those two sets of information and come to a list for each building of what we think are the priorities for each area. Then the Community Facilities Advisory Committee will help us as we sort through those priorities, and they will most likely go back around to the school buildings and help talk through with community members what the priorities are for the buildings. I will say that when you see the number of new schools that we need to build and you add in the wishes and desires of currently 50 other buildings, it is unlikely, it is for sure, that we will not be able to do everything that everyone wants. So there will be a sorting and prioritizing process that we'll have to go through simply because the cost would be exorbitant to do everything that we want. So we have categorized the needs as immediate needs, some of which you're feeling right here in Zach, and then midterm needs. So in the immediate time frame, we're looking at adding modular classrooms to many buildings. Dealing with choice, what happens in choice is that state law is that the priority for seats in a building, the number one priority goes to the children that live within the boundary of the school. That no other option of child can preempt seats for the kids who live in the boundary. So what's happening as areas are growing and schools are getting crowded, we're not changing our choice policy. It's simply that there are less and less seats available for students who do not live in the neighborhood boundary. So we're looking at also relocating some district programs. If a building is crowded and we have a regional program that's housed in that building, we're looking to see if we can move it to another building. And early childhood is one of those programs that we're having to move. We'll tell you more about that in a minute. And then in the midterm, we're looking at building additions and new schools and small boundary changes that would go mostly along with the creation of new schools. So this list of schools here are experiencing having less seats available for choice students who live outside the neighborhood boundary. And so we're looking at managing that dynamic in each one of those buildings. It is our biggest hope, and at this time we are able to do it, to let students who have choiced into a building finish there. We're going to do everything we can to avoid having to move a 4th or 5th grader out of an elementary school, for example, because the building has gotten crowded. So we're trying to manage and let kids finish where they started, if at all possible, through this whole process over the next 5 to 6 years. We're also looking at Riffenberg Elementary. They have experienced incredible growth, and they had 3 early childhood classrooms, and one by one, each year we're having to move another one of those classrooms out of that building so they can use it for a kindergarten through 5th grade classroom. And then at Fossil Ridge High School, we're looking at converting the dry science labs and making them wet, in other words, plumbing them, because that ability to have different types of science labs in there allows us to accommodate growth in that building as well. So we're looking at everything we can do inside buildings to maximize the space that's already in there. Then in the midterm, we're looking at new construction. So we're looking at a new elementary school on the southeast side of the district, on the other side of the highway. So we're looking down in the southeast portion of the Poudre School District to build a new elementary school. Oops, am I on the wrong slide? We're looking at building a permanent addition to Zach. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. I mentioned already early childhood relocating out of Riffenberg. We're looking at a new middle school, high school building east of I-25 on Prospect. We own a school site there that is large enough to do that. If you will remember, if you were around when Fossil Ridge opened, it opened with Kennard in the building. And Kennard was there for 2 years, and then Kennard's middle school was built and Kennard moved out. That is the same idea we're proposing for this Prospect site, that the high school would fill up first, and during that time, as the high school is growing, we would be building a middle school, not in this part of the plan, but in the follow-on plan. The next step would be a middle school to be able to separate. The plan is not to design an instructional program that's for 6th through 12th grade and mix all those kids up. It is rather to have 2 separate schools that are sharing a building, just as Kennard and Fossil Ridge did. We're looking at doing the same thing up near Wellington, somewhere in that area. We do believe that we will need a high school in Wellington, but we do not believe it will be as soon, based on the numbers that we have, it will not be as soon as we will need a high school on the Prospect site, more towards the southeast. They absolutely need a middle school almost immediately. So their scenario will be a little bit different. Their middle school will end up being bigger than their high school, and then the high school will grow over time. Also on the prospect site, we're looking at a athletic facility complex with multiple fields. We have incredible pressure on French Field and on all of our athletic fields. And as students grow and we have more high schools and more kids, we need more athletic fields as well. So let's talk about Zach. We're looking at putting an addition on this building to replace the 6 modular classrooms that you have now. And let me just clarify that when I say a modular building typically has 2 classrooms in it. So if you use 25 as an average number of students per class, one modular building would house about 50 kids. So across the district, those are the numbers we use as an estimate. We also believe that Zach may need another modular between now and the time the addition is built. So any additional modulars that would come onto Zach would also be replaced by the addition onto the building. Construction would begin in 2017. And we believe, based on the numbers, and I assume there'll be a question in this area, and our local expert planner can talk to you more in detail about numbers. We do believe that the neighborhood boundary around Zach is almost built out. If you look at the projections of growth that's about to happen, it's almost over. We believe that with an addition onto the building, that should do it. So that is not the case with other schools where there's lots more growth to happen in the neighborhood boundary. We do believe that an addition would be all that Zach would need. So this is the timeline we're looking at. It's in the documents that you have. Construction would be planned between 2016 and 2019 to open new schools between 2018 and 2020. Now, all of this hinges on the passage of a bond. We do not have money to build new schools. In the state of Colorado, this is how schools are funded, new construction is funded, is by going to local voters and asking for bonds. The funding that we receive from the state just to run school districts does not contemplate new construction. It was never designed that way. Other states fund school construction in different ways. Here in our state, local voters have to approve new construction. So we will do everything we have. We are now modeling and figuring out how to minimize the impact on taxes. And Mr. Montoya can explain in a moment, if you're interested, how bonds work. And when bonds are paid off, if you think of it as a mortgage, when your mortgage is paid off, your payments stop. We're doing the best that we can to structure this potential bond so that as one payment is dropping off of your tax roll, the other one would come on to minimize the increase. However, construction costs have increased phenomenally just in the last 2 to 3 years. So we do anticipate that the cost for the improvements to our current buildings as well as this new construction will be large compared to what we are used to asking for, simply because the costs are skyrocketing. But we are working very hard to minimize that so that the difference on any individual's tax roll would be as small as possible. And we are working on financial modeling now, and we'll have those numbers by the fall. We'll be able to come back out and give you the numbers that we're actually looking at. Now, as we grow, all of the support services grow. We already are maxed out at our 2 transportation facilities with places to park buses. And of course, as you have more schools, you have more buses and more transportation requirements, as well as administration and, importantly, information technology. So all of our technology systems have to increase as the numbers of users increase as well. We're looking, these topics here we do not have proposed solutions for yet, but they are on the table, and the committee is still working on these issues, so we'll be bringing more information out in the fall on all of these. We have a possibility of some of our alternative types of programs, developing some satellites We know that many of our alternative programs are very popular and they're all centralized. As the district spreads out a bit, we're looking, do we need to provide some of those alternative programs at alternative sites and satellites? So that's one of the things we're looking at. We're particularly studying Preston and Kennard Middle School. Those two middle schools are very overcrowded and are very close to each other. One is a 100% choice school, the other has a boundary. It's a particularly interesting phenomenon, and the committee is working to model some of the options for managing the growth in those two buildings. As I mentioned, early childhood is a struggle. We're having to move those programs out in order to use those classrooms in local elementary schools, and that is disturbing to all of us. We know that we have a growing need for early childhood, and that parents want to have their littlest children as close to home as possible. So it's a struggle to figure out where early childhood would go. Our past practice has been to always have it near in a neighboring school, in a neighborhood school. But because of space constraints, we may end up with sections of the district where we have to have a regionalized program where parents will have to transport their kids farther, which is not ideal with little people. And then also the heat mitigation efforts. Our engineering study is about to finish up, or getting close to finishing up, looking at heat issues in all of the buildings, particularly our oldest buildings. And so that the recommendations from that study and what we decide to do with those recommendations will also become part of this plan, and that work is not finished yet. So we have several groups of community members who are helping us with this process. First, we have the long-range planning group itself. Then we have just formed up our Community Facilities Advisory Committee, where we have asked community members to come join us in listening to community members during these forums and helping us as we look at this plan and listen to the community on our behalf. In the fall, we will call up the boundary committee. Typically in the district, what has been done is when a boundary is being proposed to move, and you will see in the plan we have actual proposals of where we think boundaries should probably be. We call up this committee of community members to examine those boundaries. So in each area where a new school is going to be built, that new school will need a boundary. So all of those students who are scooped up from another school to go to that, those boundary changes will involve kids that get to go to the new building. So that's usually a fairly popular thing, is I'm changing schools, but my family gets to go to the new building. And once again, we will do our best through this process to let children finish where they have started. So most of these buildings will start with new neighborhoods and with new grade levels, phasing in as much as possible so that kids can finish where they started. And then we are proposing a small boundary change between Riffenburg and Laurel. Riffenburg is very full and Laurel has a little bit of room, so there's just a very small area that the boundary committee will look at to shift from one school to the other. And then we have our Mill Bond Monitoring Committee, which is a group of community members, many of whom campaigned and worked very hard for the last Mill Bond election. They get together regularly and monitor on behalf of the community what we're doing with that money. So we provide reports to them and talk with them about what was the intention in the ballot language, and is the district doing what we said we would do.
And some of the potential impacts. So just quickly, obviously there's modulars here. How many more are planned for a short-term solution?
I think that coincides with the growth. Our first commitment is to make sure we have adequate space and serve our neighborhood students, as Dr. Smizer mentioned, part of our school choice policy. Number one of the 8 levels is that our neighborhood students are served. We also want to maintain the most optimal education and learning environment we can. Right now we have a couple out there. Keep in mind, modulars are also actually 2 classrooms. We can serve 25 students in each, so one modular could conceivably serve 50 students. So as far as how many go there, it's going to depend on how fast the growth is. We recognize that a lot of the growth, especially in Timnath, as we've seen from articles, as well as some of the neighborhoods where it's coming up already, will drive that decision in the next couple of years.
So a lot of questions around the impact of kids and where they actually wind up attending school. So this comment says, it'd be great if there was some flexibility for families with multiple kids and schools on when kids will switch to new schools. Not necessarily saying that they have to stay in the same track that they have, but some flexibility on that timing piece of it as well. Is that taken into consideration as you look at boundaries and potential changes?
Well, I would say I would consider that as part of the phasing in of a new building. So as we open a new building, it's not uncommon to have certain grade levels start in that building, typically the younger ones, and then other siblings can come if they want or if they want to finish out. So depending on how tightly packed our buildings are, that will determine how much flexibility can we have. We would love to let all kids finish where they are if possible and start just new children in the new school. We may not have that luxury depending on how packed out we are by that time.
So along the same lines of potential boundaries, we have a map up here that looks a little bit at the proposal of where we are now with our boundaries. And it does, and I think I've heard you say this before, Dr. Smizer, where we're not considering a lot of boundary changes. When you build a new school, you scoop up some kids from the surrounding areas. So the question is, if there's kids that are currently here or currently in elementary school, will they still have the choice of Preston, Kennard, or new school, or how will those options look for people in this area?
It's going to depend on where they live. As we expand boundaries, keep in mind that the students that will be impacted as ninth graders when a new high school, middle school comes up are going to enter sixth grade next year. Those that are going to be impacted if they change a middle school will be first graders next fall. Again, it's going to depend on where they are. Choice is still going to be part of our work. Parents will still have opportunities, and again, choice will be determined by availability of space, making sure the neighborhood students are taken care of first. So those options are still going to be there. Even though boundaries could change, new schools will be built, choice will still be an option, and again, it'll be determined by the capacity of a building and how much of that is being utilized.
So staying on this theme, since
Sure.
we're here, looking at the proposal here, it appears that a lot of the neighborhoods that will be impacted from the new middle school, high school are east of, is that right? East of I-25. Is that a fair generalization of what neighborhoods might be scooped up into that new boundary?
Yes, I-25 provides a fairly clean and usable boundary. You don't want children necessarily walking over I-25. So, as a study area, I-25 is very clean, provided a very clean break to analyze and study the current students and to look at future growth. So that's a fair statement that I-25 is a good boundary to try to maintain.
And if I could add, when these schools would all be built, we would essentially have a fifth feeder system on the other side of the highway, right? Of elementary, middle, high, all on the east side of I-25.
So when we look at big picture, not only impacts to this school, but some of the other schools, do we have sort of any sense of what schools will be most impacted, what schools will lose the most students, or, and how quickly that will happen?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a stab at that. As we look at the growth projections, basically what we're anticipating is that the new buildings will open much fuller than some of the new construction we've done in the past. Now, directly, what schools may be impacted by this, one that we would be paying very close attention to is Timnath Elementary, as that has the potential for, at least in the short term, and when we say short term, we're talking about maybe 2 or 3 years, where that growth may not have picked up quite to the level where it's necessary to help support that program. So we'll be watching that one very closely. For all the other schools, our projections are that the growth will be there to be able to provide programming at those schools.
We had some possible numbers. Yeah.
Be warned, he has a spreadsheet.
I always have a spreadsheet. So taking this study area, if I understand your question correctly, if we just look at the middle school students, East of I-25 in this currently defined study area, there's about 484 current students. Now of that, there's give or take 300 that attend Preston, another 125 that attend Kennard, and Lesher 50, and then the rest are spread throughout. But yes, we're tracking, and we will provide that information to, the boundary committee as it forms up. And as we analyze these areas, we can tell where the current students are, and then I'm also tracking where the new single-family and multifamily developments are. So east of I-25, I currently have about 1,700 planned single-family and multifamily units, and about 2,200 to 2,400 that I know are coming on the books. Some of those are being built as we speak. As you drive on County Road 5, you can see that. So, as an example, we are looking and analyzing these numbers. Like I said, we can pull the current numbers and project future numbers. Now, as far as the choice impact, that's not really my realm. I track choice, but the impact and how that's managed is.
And I would say also from the elementary perspective, like Dave said, the 3 buildings that'll be most impacted by the new elementary school will be in order of level of impact. Bethke will have the most based on where they are. As you can imagine, if we're going southeast, we'll take a couple hundred or so out of Bethke. Then the second would be Timnath. And then third would be a small slice of Bacon down on the southeast corner, down on the other side of the reservoir. And we'll watch those. And Dave mentioned something I think is important. Other buildings that have opened up, particularly Bacon, Bethke, and Zach, did not open with a large amount of their building being utilized. This building, we anticipate a building of approximately built for about 600 would open just under 500, meaning that the other buildings that are in the surrounding area won't be as impacted if people try to make choice decisions to go there. So we'll pay attention to that as well.
So staying on the west side of I-25, we heard a little bit about some of the boundaries, or maybe rezoning is another way to look at the language. Will the boundary committee look at, is it the Werner-Preston neighborhoods, and look at some of the boundaries on this side of the highway as well? And do we have any predictions for how that might pan out?
Yeah, I think that all the boundaries, when a boundary committee comes together, I think our first focus is to look at the impacted areas. So I don't think anything's out of the question as we go through that work. And certainly because Preston is so, hello. Take the call, Lynn. Okay, not too distracting. But sure. We all know Preston, we're sitting right here in the building, and it's a highly impacted school, right? We're over 100% utilization at this point. So yeah, I think that's something we would pay close attention to. We'll try to make it most optimum. At the same time, we're also trying to minimize our impact on other areas and not try to carve up the entire district.
So looking beyond boundaries and more at general community impacts, was the affordable housing or the land banks potentially built by the city included in your demographic reports and considerations? And how does sort of affordable housing and predictions of the development of affordable housing impact potential growth?
So we do coordinate with the local municipalities, the county and the cities, and we see all the referrals. I get all the referrals. So as those affordable housing projects come through in their plat stages, we do see that trying to estimate the yield of students that we're going to gain out of that really depends on the price point and the number of bedrooms. So yes, we do take a look at that. Specifically that one item, there aren't that many of the projects when you look at the whole scope of our region. You've got a great deal of single family and multifamily compared to the affordable housing. So yes, we do take that into account, and they come through as a regular subdivision plat, and we do track those, and we try to analyze as best we can what the student yield out of that will be and the impact it will have on the schools.
What role does diversity play in drawing our boundaries and trying to fill schools? Do we take into consideration race and this is SES? Wow, an acronym, socioeconomic status. Do we take into consideration those factors, and how do they play in our decisions?
The boundary committee, and its composition of, various experts and, parents, educators, that group will take a look at a wide variety of of impacts, whether it's socioeconomic, whether it's physical boundaries, safe routes to school, safe biking routes, walking routes. All of these things are taken into account when the boundary committee meets. So yes, the short answer is all of the above will be taken into account when the community and the experts try to get together and create a consensus of what the new boundary will look like.
Right. Again,
Hope that answered your question.
Again, looking big picture, so are we taking into account the likely increases in traffic, and how do we anticipate the bus rides from the southeast corner to the Prospect site? And if that sounds like it might take a little bit of time to get across town, given the traffic these days and the continued growth. Do we have an estimate on what that travel time might look like, and how does that again play into the location decisions?
So transportation would have to create a study. Once we get further along in the boundary discussion, they will analyze, the times. Yes, we try to take, distance into account when we, A, purchase property, and B, recommend property to be utilized as a school site. So yes, that will be taken into account. As far as traffic studies, we can simply make recommendations to whatever municipality is being impacted. So as we develop a site, we must pay for the improvements to that infrastructure and work with the city or county or town to improve the streets to whatever level they dictate. They are the traffic engineers, and they would dictate the, whether it's a major arterial or collector or what have you. But the time that it would take for busing would be analyzed by transportation. And as far as the actual traffic patterns, that's the city engineers and the traffic engineers that would spearhead that project.
And I'd like to add too that that this is a question that comes up often about the infrastructure and the traffic flows, and we recognize that having to, and we currently are coordinating with those agencies to understand what we're doing, what they're seeing.
Going to give you all fair warning. I've been looking at this clock, which has said the same thing. I never even realized that it was to 9. So I'm going to start making us go a little bit faster through these questions. There's still plenty of time to submit questions, and we will get to them. And so I'm going to do my best to hurry us along here. But fair warning, if I start cutting people off, I apologize. So how will the proposed plan affect Fort Collins High School? And there's a concern maybe about a negative effect similar to that of that what happened when Fossil opened.
If I'm understanding your question correctly, once the boundary's done, do you mean by the new high school being built, then what would be
Correct.
impact? Yeah, I think, as Dr. Smizer said, it essentially creates the 5th feeder, and boundaries will be impacted. How it will affect Fort Collins in particular is going to depend on the growth pattern in the next 2 to 3 years. As we know, Fort Collins had a little bit of a drop in the last few years, and they've picked that back up. They will be, though, impacted because that would be one of the closer schools to them. So it's reasonable to think that they're going to have some numbers there, but again, we think growth fill will help with that, and we'll pay attention to that. As Brendan said, boundary committees are going to pay close attention to impacts not only on what's coming in, but also impact on existing buildings. So to be specific, hard to say 4 years out.
As we look at building these new schools, are we considering air conditioning? Not that it's warm in here at all, but is that on the list?
Boy, I think I might be out of my league. I think I'm going to do the smart thing.
Unable to make it at the last minute today, so normally we lob that question over to him.
It's right here.
Yeah, but I will say that it's certainly on the list to consider, and we will have all new construction has some type of tempered air or cooling system of some kind, if not full on air conditioning, and so that'll be part of what we call the ed specs, the actual design of the building.
Looking at the new middle school, high school, so if a student is going to Fossil or Preston when the new school is open, will they be allowed to finish at where they are, or will they essentially have to move with the boundary or with the new boundary, with the new school?
As we stated before, it's going to depend on what the space is that's available. Optimal is that we would let students, especially at those higher grades in the building, what we call grandfather in, stay there. And of course, we want to give them that option, but it's going to depend. I think the complexity on that one has to do with siblings. Quite often we may say if you're a 4th grader or a 5th grader or an 8th grader in a middle school in the coming year when the new school opens, we'd like to afford you that opportunity to stay. Is it possible to keep the family members intact at the other schools and stay in that potential line? That's going to depend on just how crowded we are from the outset and when the building opens.
So how does that transition happen? You know, it's the school opens, and then is it just sort of like a mass movement of children and teachers, or does that happen more gradually? Can you sort of walk us through what that might look like?
Yeah, there's two parts to that question. The first one has to do with how students go. You'll notice then that when a new school opens, a new boundary is created. So we take the students there, and then again, back to your previous question, if they already are in another building and want to stay, we evaluate that and what the possibilities are. So that boundary, what we hope to do is to build in an area where that growth is going to be impacted and it's going to start filling that location. As regarding staff, we start that process the prior year as we hire. Of course, we would hire a principal, we would go through, and then we would have a hiring process where staff members existing in the district as well as any could apply and try to go ahead and have a teaching opportunity in that building. It's just on a large scale. Most of our buildings may hire anywhere from 2 to 5, maybe to 7 teachers in a year. In this case, you're building an entire staff, so the process might not look entirely the same. And I would say that we would be out in front of that maybe a little sooner to give that staff an opportunity to build as a cohesive unit.
Staying on the middle school, high school discussion, would those students be bused together to the new site, or would that be done separately?
We actually haven't modeled that yet, so we don't know the answer to that question yet.
And I think that goes back to, I think we've had this concern before, you know, a 6th grader and a 12th grader are two very different beings. So,
Right.
you know, putting them together in a facility is one thing, but maybe putting them together in a bus might have a different
I
result.
think I was just confirming, I have this knowledge as a parent, not necessarily my role as a finance director, but the currently, I know that the middle school and high school, at least in my area, share the same bus already.
They go together anyway. There you go.
I'm not sure that's district-wide. I know personally that's true in my
Okay.
theater.
So there you go. So potentially, it sounds like it's not unprecedented. Again, staying with the new facility out on Prospect, does the city's Southeast Community Pool planning play into the decision not to build an aquatic center? And can we, as a community, advocate for them to, you know, speed up that process? It sounds like there's a need for a pool or desire for a pool.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with what that group's doing. I will tell you the piece that that really, I think where we're coming with our decision is as we've looked at other school districts that have pools, the operating costs for these pools are enormous. And I mean, we've heard up to potentially $1 million a year just to operate a pool. Understanding the budget, and I understand everybody doesn't understand the budget the way I do, but right now that just can't be a priority when we're dealing with this growth. That there's other priorities ahead of that.
And it's my understanding that the city's plan includes a recreation pool and not laps. That's my latest understanding, but you're nodding, so some other people have heard that too. Okay.
Again, we're going to blaze through these next 6 minutes, so please, if you have more questions, write them down. And if we don't get to them tonight, we certainly will get to them online. That goes for the folks watching at home, too. Please send in your questions to info@psdschools.org. The more questions we get, the better these conversations are. And I'm just going to start talking really fast. So you had mentioned in the presentation that we haven't quite figured out the Preston Kennard thing. Is there a timeline for addressing that?
I should ask the committee members, do you want to take a stab at the timeline?
Yeah, I think not a firm timeline, but we know we need to address it quickly as growth is upon us and right in front of us. I think that'll probably be one of the very first things we address when those committees are established. I think we saw the slides up there of when that work will go. Also keep in mind we're dealing with that growth ongoing now, particularly in this building with the use of modulars and of course some of the management with choice.
Any consideration of making Kennard a neighborhood school or other 100% choice schools neighborhood schools?
You know, I think all options, we've talked about a lot of different things. We've learned historically, though, that on the southeast side of town, folks have wanted an all-choice elementary and an all-choice middle school. So while that certainly could be an option that we consider, one of the things we want to also pay attention to is the potential to move families in a pattern twice. And we'd sure like to avoid that. So if we end up carving up boundaries and then do that again when the new middle school, high school situation opens, there could be a particular segment that could be in a spot where we have to make some double moves there. We'd like to try to avoid that, but again, I think all smart options are on the table, at least discussable at this time.
Sort of circling back to boundaries a little bit, we've talked a lot about this part of the community, the southeast part of the community. What about impacts to other places in the district? And particularly, will there be any proposed boundary changes, or do you anticipate any, having lived in Old Town and the neighborhood schools and in a different town? So for example, Trilby Road is a Fort Collins address, but a Loveland school district. So is there any sort of other maybe big picture changes of boundaries that folks should be aware of? No.
No.
Let me at least address the last part of that question that talked about changing district boundaries, not school boundaries, but actual districts, so like Poudre School District and Thompson. There is a mechanism in state law that allows that to happen. I will tell you it is next to impossible to see that all the way through. It takes moving mountains literally to get that to happen. You have to get both voters on both sides to agree that that happens. You have to split existing debt and mill levy overrides. There's a whole step process, and again, I haven't looked at the law lately, but it's very lengthy and next to impossible to happen. What might happen with district boundaries, and this is kind of a rabbit trail, but we might see consolidation of smaller districts. I know that the state has looked at trying to incentivize smaller districts to consolidate for efficiencies, but I don't think that has any impact on what we're talking about here.
Thank you. So do we anticipate that these new schools and all of the proposed changes in this plan will increase opportunities for school of choice?
I think that's a possibility. Again, it depends on how quickly that growth comes to be and how much space is available once those new buildings are built. But you know, the idea is to address some of the overcrowding too.
All right, so coming full circle here, we talked at the beginning of the Q&A session about what if the bond doesn't pass. So if we do have to go to Plan B, how much community input will be considered in developing Plan B? And when will that plan be released, or when will that process start in earnest?
So if the bond doesn't pass, Plan B, we don't have Plan B developed. We will have a Plan B available next fall as we come together. But as far as community involvement goes, I would expect that we would have major community involvement in that, because the options beyond the bond get to be more drastic, I believe, and more impactful. So at that point, we are talking about larger boundary shifts. We're talking about changes in the way we might be busing kids. We've even talked about, you know, the potential of trying to extend school years, things like that. That's strategies that we've seen in other areas of the state. Particularly, there's a district that just didn't pass a bond, and now they're looking at doing some very drastic changes to how they operate on a day-to-day basis.
You know, just to add on, we, as part of our due diligence as a group, we already are, you know, vetting out some of scenarios and what ifs, and looking into other districts that have had to do this thing, you know, in the past. So we are looking into it as a group and as a district. We're doing our due diligence and looking at all the options so we can start preparing that plan for input.
Well, it's just about 6:30, and I made a promise, and I'm going to try and keep it. So before we wrap up, Dr. Smizer, anything you'd like to add?
Just thanks very much for coming and for talking to us and asking your questions. We really will, in 48 hours, have all the questions that were asked tonight, including the ones we didn't get to, if there are any, answered on the website, as well as all the other forms that we have. All the information is there as well. You can watch me make this presentation 8 times if you want to. But all of the Q&A and the combination of them into an FAQ is all on the website. And then please just ask any question you want. It doesn't have to be related to one of these presentations. But if you have a great question, send it in and we'll answer it for you.
Wonderful. It really is a great resource. So again, psdschools.org. On the right-hand side, you'll see a link to this planning effort, and all of those resources are there for you. If you have an epiphany when you walk out the door, again, send those emails and thoughts and comments and questions to info@psdschools.org. And with that, I will let us get out of here, and thank you all so much for coming tonight. Appreciate it.